He stood in the dusty showroom, a $5,000 repair estimate in his calloused hand. The dealership owner sneered, telling him to go back where he came from. He didn't know he was talking to a man born 12 miles down the road and about to cost him absolutely everything. The late May sun was an anvil pressing down on the rolling hills of Highgrove, a punishing heat that baked the topsoil until it cracked like old porcelain. Cyrus Reed sat in the worn vinyl seat of a 1982 John Deere 444. Oh, the roar of the diesel engine, the only sound for miles. His hands thick with calluses and permanently stained with the ghosts of 1,000 oil changes gripped the steering wheel as he navigated the terraced acreage. He was fighting a losing battle against time. The planting window was closing. The rain was forecasted to hit in 3 days, and he still had 200 acres of soybeans to get into the earth. This farm had been in the Reed family for 4 generations, but Cyrus had been away for a long time. At 18, suffocated by the endless cycle of debt and drought, he had packed a single duffel bag and joined the Navy, eventually transitioning into civilian life as a heavy machinery engineer operating out of Seattle. He had built a life of steel and concrete, far removed from the unpredictability of the sky and the soil. But when his grandfather Arthur Reed passed away suddenly in the dead of winter, the deed to the farm was left entirely to him. Returning to Highgrove wasn't a choice. It was a blood obligation. But the town had changed in the 15 years he had been gone. The familiar faces had aged or moved away, replaced by a new breed of corporate agricultural managers and aggressive local businessmen who viewed the remaining family farms not as neighbors, but as prey. Cyrus, with his quiet demeanor and his out-of-state license plates, was perceived as an outsider. The locals whispered that he was just another city transplant, a hobby farmer who would sell out to the highest bidder before the first frost. Cyrus didn't care about the whispers. He only cared about the tractor. The 4440 was a stubborn beast, an heirloom that Arthur had kept running through sheer willpower and wire ties. But as Cyrus reached the end of the southern ridge, a catastrophic sound shattered the rhythm of the afternoon. It wasn't a grind, but a sharp, agonizing crack, followed by the sickening whine of starved hydraulics. Cyrus slammed the clutch, killing the PTO and throwing the engine into neutral. He was out of the cab before the dust had settled his boots, hitting the dirt, as a thick plume of black smoke coughed from the exhaust. A dark, viscous puddle was already forming beneath the rear axle, bleeding into the dry earth. "Damn it," Cyrus breathed, wiping a mixture of sweat and dust from his forehead. He slid underneath the massive green chassis, ignoring the searing heat of the metal. His eyes, trained by years of diagnosing multi-million-dollar ship engines, immediately identified the problem. The main hydraulic pump housing had sheared the internal seals completely blown out. It was a fatal failure for the planting season. Without hydraulics, the tractor was a 10-ton paperweight. He needed a new pump assembly, and he needed it today. There was only one place within a 100-mile radius that stocked heavy agricultural parts, Coburn Implement, and Supply. The dealership was a sprawling modern facility situated on the edge of the county line, a gleaming monument to green and yellow iron. It had been built by old man Coburn, a fair and honest dealer whom Arthur had trusted. But the old man had passed a few years back, leaving the enterprise to his son Wyatt Coburn. Cyrus climbed into his rusted Ford F-25. Oh, the suspension groaning as he threw his tools into the bed. He knew the reputation Wyatt had cultivated. Wyatt was known for price gouging independent farmers, leveraging his monopoly to force them into predatory financing on new equipment when their old rigs broke down. He operated less like a community partner and more like a toll collector on a dying highway. As Cyrus drove the 12 miles toward town, the landscape shifting from open fields to commercial lots, a cold determination settled over him. He wasn't the naive farm boy who had left Highgrove 15 years ago. He knew machines, he knew supply chains, and he knew when someone was trying to put a boot on his neck. The dealership parking lot was packed with pristine million-dollar combines and gleaming utility tractors that looked like they had never seen a day of actual mud. Cyrus parked his battered truck between two brand-new, heavily financed luxury pickups, the contrast stark and undeniable. He grabbed the broken, oil-slicked pump housing from his truck bed, hoisting the heavy metal onto his shoulder, and walked through the sliding glass doors of Coburn Implement and Supply. The blast of air conditioning was a shock to his system, but his focus was singular. He was about to find out just how bad the rot in his hometown had gotten. The interior of Coburn Implement and Supply looked more like a high-end luxury car dealership than a farm equipment supplier. Polished concrete floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new rubber. A massive display screen looped drone footage of autonomous tractors harvesting perfect fields. It was a sterile, sanitized version of agriculture, entirely disconnected from the dirt and sweat Cyrus had just left behind. Behind the long granite-topped parts counter stood a young clerk furiously typing on a keyboard, looking entirely out of his depth. But Cyrus's eyes bypassed the clerk and landed on the man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the manager's office. Wyatt Coburn. He was dressed in a crisp, unwrinkled button-down shirt with a subtle monogram on the cuff. His hair perfectly coiffed his boots, a spotless, expensive leather that had clearly never stepped in manure. Wyatt was currently holding court with two men in matching polo shirts, corporate reps by the look of them. Wyatt was laughing a loud, practiced sound that echoed across the showroom. Cyrus walked up to the counter, the heavy iron pump housing hitting the granite with a dull, resonant thud that silenced the ambient chatter in the room. The young clerk jumped. Can I help you, sir? Need a complete hydraulic pump assembly for an 824440. Cyrus said, his voice low and steady. Part number should be AR85250 or whatever the updated cross-reference is. I need the seal kit and the mounting flange, too. The clerk blinked, clearly intimidated by Cyrus's grease-stained appearance and the sheer commanding certainty in his voice. He began frantically tapping at his terminal. Right. Let me check the inventory system. The classic models they can be tricky. As the clerk fumbled, Wyatt Coburn noticed the disruption. He excused himself from the corporate reps and strolled out of his office, his eyes performing a rapid, dismissive assessment of Cyrus. He took in the faded denim, the dirt caked into the boots, and the complete lack of deference in Cyrus's posture. Wyatt's lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. "Having trouble, Toby?" Wyatt asked, coming to stand behind the clerk. "He needs a main hydraulic assembly for a 444. Oh, Mr. Coburn," Toby squeaked. "System says we have one in the back, but it's flagged under reserve." Wyatt waved Toby away and leaned against the counter, looking at the broken pump housing as if it were a piece of garbage. "An 82, huh?" You're out of luck, buddy. That part is obsolete. We don't stock dinosaur bones. Your clerk just said you have one in the back, Cyrus replied, his face an unreadable mask. That one is reserved for our priority service contract members, Wyatt said smoothly, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. And even if I could sell it to you over the counter, the retail on that assembly, plus the priority unboxing fee, is going to run you about $5,200. Cyrus didn't flinch. He knew the actual retail cost of that pump, even with inflation and markup, shouldn't exceed $1,500. Wyatt wasn't just marking it up. He was weaponizing the price to force a different conversation. $5,000 is theft, Cyrus stated, keeping his voice perfectly level. The wholesale on that unit from the manufacturer is roughly $800. I'll give you $2,000 cash right now. Wyatt's eyes narrowed. The condescending smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged on his pricing, let alone by a man who looked like a day laborer. Look, friend, Wyatt said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I don't know how things work wherever you blew in from, but here in Highgrove, we run a modern business. I see guys like you every spring. City money buying up 20 acres, thinking you're going to play farmer on the weekends with antique junk. Then the iron breaks and you come in here demanding miracles. Wyatt tapped the granite counter. I can't sell you that pump, but what I can do is set you up with our sales department. We have a fantastic financing program for the new 5 Series utility tractors. Low down payment. We can haul that 4440 off your hands for scrap value. Save you a lot of headaches. It was the classic squeeze. Starve the independent farmer of parts, quote astronomical repair costs, and trap them in a lifetime of debt on a new machine that required proprietary dealer software just to change the oil. Cyrus had seen this exact predatory tactic ruin good men in his grandfather's generation. I don't need a new tractor, Cyrus said, his gaze locking on to Wyatt's. I need the part, and I know you have it. You're legally obligated as a franchise dealer to sell over-the-counter parts to the public without forcing a service contract. Wyatt stood up straight, his face flushing with anger. His authority had been questioned in front of his staff and his corporate guests. I am not obligated to do a damn thing for you. I decide who gets priority in this county. I know every legitimate farmer in a 50-mile radius, and I have never seen you in my life. You're a liability. You sure about that? Cyrus asked softly. I'm positive. Wyatt spat, his voice rising, drawing the attention of everyone in the showroom. We don't do business with out-of-towners trying to play farmer and telling me how to run my shop. Get your junk off my counter, get out of my dealership, and go back where you came from. Silence descended on the room. Toby the clerk stared wide-eyed. The corporate reps shifted uncomfortably by the window. Cyrus didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fist on the counter. He simply reached out, grabbed the heavy iron pump housing, and hoisted it back onto his shoulder. He looked Wyatt Coburn dead in the eye. I was born 12 miles down the road at Highgrove Acres, Cyrus said, his voice carrying the dangerous, quiet weight of an incoming storm. My grandfather Arthur Reed bought his first tractor from your father before you were even a thought in his head. And the place I came from, Wyatt. It's the dirt you're standing on. Wyatt's face paled slightly at the mention of Arthur Reed, a name that still commanded immense respect in the valley. But before Wyatt could formulate a response, Cyrus turned on his heel. "Keep the pump," Cyrus called over his shoulder as he walked toward the sliding glass doors. "You're going to need the inventory when the auditors get here." Cyrus walked out into the blinding sunlight, throwing the broken part into the bed of his truck. He hadn't gotten the pump, and his fields were still sitting empty. But as he started the loud, clattering engine of his F-25, he wasn't thinking about the soybeans anymore. Wyatt Coburn had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had drawn a line in the dirt, assuming the man standing across from him was a helpless victim. He didn't realize that Cyrus Reed spent the last 15 years reverse engineering multi-million-dollar mechanical systems, and he was about to apply those exact same skills to dismantle Coburn Implement and supply piece by piece. The planting could wait. It was time for a harvest of a different kind. The drive back to Highgrove Acres wasn't defeated. It was calculating. Cyrus Reed didn't see a broken tractor when he looked at the 4440. He saw a fluid dynamics problem. Wyatt Coburn assumed Cyrus was trapped in the closed ecosystem of agricultural retail, where the dealer held the only keys to the kingdom. Wyatt didn't understand that for the last 15 years, Cyrus had been keeping aging rusted bulk carriers and naval vessels running in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, using nothing but scrap metal industrial catalogs and sheer mechanical genius. Cyrus pulled his F-250 into the cavernous drafty barn that smelled of old hay and diesel fuel. He dropped the shattered hydraulic pump onto his heavy steel workbench. He didn't need Coburn's overpriced obsolete part. Hydraulics were universal. It was just a matter of flow rate pressure and mounting brackets. He pulled out his laptop, brushing a layer of dust off the keyboard, and booted it up. He bypassed the agricultural dealer networks entirely and logged into a commercial heavy industry portal he maintained access to from his Seattle days. He needed a pump that pushed 22 gallons per minute at 2,250 pounds per square inch. Within 20 minutes, he found a surplus industrial gear pump from a decommissioned forestry logging skidder in Spokane. It was stronger, more durable, and completely over-engineered for a farm tractor. The cost, $450. He dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hey, Big Jim, it's Cyrus," he said, when the gruff voice answered on the other end. "I need a favor. I need a Parker Hannifin commercial gear pump. Part number PG33. Put on a Greyhound bus to Highgrove tonight. I'll wire you the cash and an extra $200 for the hassle." "Consider it done, Navy," Jim grunted. "Bus drops off at the depot at 5 a.m. Cyrus didn't sleep that night. He fired up his grandfather's old Lincoln arc welder and spent the dark hours fabricating a custom half-inch steel adapter plate. He measured cut and ground the metal, the shower of golden sparks illuminating the barn, casting long dancing shadows against the corrugated tin walls. He machined a custom spline shaft to mate the industrial pump to the John Deere's power takeoff drive. It was precision engineering applied to brute force machinery. At dawn, he picked up the pump from the sleepy bus depot, hauled it back, and bolted it onto the custom plate. He plumbed the high-pressure lines, bled the air from the system, and topped off the hydraulic fluid. Cyrus climbed into the cab and turned the key. The 4440 roared to life, a thick plume of exhaust rocketing from the stack. He engaged the hydraulic levers. The heavy rear planter lift arms snapped up with a smooth, violent authority they hadn't possessed in a decade. The forestry pump was working perfectly, running quiet and cold under the strain. He had beaten Wyatt's $5,000 ransom for under $700. For the next 48 hours, Cyrus didn't stop. He ran the tractor under the stadium lights he rigged to the cab, the roar of the diesel echoing across the valley as he cut straight, perfect rows into the earth. The planter sang a rhythmic, clattering tune, burying the soybean seeds in the dark soil. He finished the last acre of the southern ridge, just as the wind shifted, carrying the heavy scent of ozone and damp earth. 10 minutes later, the skies opened up, delivering the steady soaking rain the crops desperately needed. Sitting on his porch, nursing a black coffee and watching the rain turn the dust into mud, Cyrus felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. The farm was alive, but as he watched the water pool in the yard, his thoughts turned back to the gleaming showroom of Coburn Implement. He had survived the squeeze, but he knew other farmers in the valley didn't have heavy industry contacts or fabrication skills. They were bleeding out. 2 days later, Cyrus drove into town and parked outside Rusty's Diner, the local gathering spot for High Grove's agricultural community. The diner was a time capsule of faded linoleum and cheap coffee filled with men wearing weather-beaten hats and deep lines of worry on their faces. Cyrus walked in and took a seat at the counter. The room went slightly quiet. They all knew Arthur Reed's grandson had come back, and small-town gossip moved faster than a prairie fire. They had heard about the confrontation at Coburn's. An older man with a weathered face and a faded flannel shirt slid onto the stool next to Cyrus. It was Tom Henderson, a man who had farmed 300 acres bordering the river for 40 years. "Heard you gave Wyatt Coburn a piece of your mind," Tom said, his voice raspy, staring straight ahead at the pie case. "I told him no," Cyrus replied evenly. "Apparently that's a rare word in his showroom." Tom let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "It is these days. Cost me my western 80 acres to learn that word. Wyatt's got a stranglehold on this county, Cyrus. It ain't just about marking up parts anymore. It's the software." Cyrus turned his head, his engineering instincts immediately engaged. "Software. The new machines." Tom explained, lowering his voice. "We can't fix a damn thing on them. You blow a sensor, change a fuel filter, and the tractor's computer goes into limp mode. Locks the transmission at 2 miles an hour until you pay Wyatt Service Tech $300 just to plug in his laptop and clear the digital code. They call it unauthorized tampering. I call it a hostage situation." "Right to repair lockouts," Cyrus murmured, familiar with the predatory practices creeping into the industry. "Worse," whispered another voice. Greg Stanton, a younger farmer heavily leveraged in debt, leaned over from the adjacent booth. "I bought a brand new 5 Series from him last year, had a minor transmission shudder. Wyatt's shop took it in, claimed the whole hydrostatic drive was shot. They billed corporate for a massive warranty replacement, but I marked the original casing with a UV pen before I brought it in." They never swapped the drive, Cyrus. They just recalibrated the software, billed the manufacturer for 20 grand in phantom parts, and charged me 2,000 for uncovered diagnostic labor. Cyrus's eyes hardened. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Wyatt Coburn wasn't just a greedy businessman overcharging for parts. He was running a sophisticated two-front fraud operation. He was illegally locking farmers out of their own equipment to extort labor fees, while simultaneously defrauding the corporate manufacturer with fake warranty claims. "Why hasn't anyone reported him?" Cyrus asked. To who? Tom replied bitterly. The local sheriff goes hunting with Wyatt on his private lease. And corporate Wyatt is their top-grossing regional dealer. He moves millions in inventory. They look the other way as long as the sales numbers stay high. We're trapped. You can't farm without iron, and in Highgrove, Wyatt owns the iron. Cyrus looked down at his calloused hands. He thought about his grandfather, a man who believed a handshake was a binding contract and that a machine belonged to the man who bought it. Wyatt had turned that legacy into a digital extortion racket. "Greg," Cyrus said, softly turning to the younger farmer, "that 5 Series tractor of yours, is it throwing any error codes right now?" "Yeah," Greg sighed. "Through a critical exhaust fluid fault yesterday. Tractor won't go over 3 miles an hour. Wyatt says it needs a whole new emissions array, 5,000 out of pocket. I don't have it. My corn is going to rot in the field." Cyrus pulled a $10 bill from his wallet and laid it on the counter. He looked at Greg, a dangerous cold smile playing on his lips. "I'll be at your barn in an hour," Cyrus said. "Don't call Wyatt. We're going to pull those codes ourselves." Greg Stanton's barn was immaculate, housing a massive gleaming green John Deere 5 Series utility tractor that looked more like a spaceship than a piece of farm equipment. It was a beautiful machine currently rendered completely useless by a few lines of proprietary code. Cyrus arrived carrying a heavy shockproof Pelican case. He popped the latches, revealing a setup that made Greg take a step back. It wasn't standard mechanics tools. It was a ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook wired into a custom-built CAN bus analyzer, a device Cyrus used to tap into the encrypted neural networks of naval destroyers and commercial cargo cranes. "Cyrus, if Wyatt finds out we plugged third-party hardware into the diagnostic port, he'll void the entire drivetrain warranty." Greg warned, his voice tight with anxiety. "Wyatt's warranty isn't worth the paper. It's printed on Greg." Cyrus replied, locating the OBD2 style diagnostic port under the tractor's steering column. "And I'm not using third-party software. I'm just listening to what the machine is saying." Cyrus plugged the interface cable in and booted his software. He wasn't trying to rewrite the proprietary operating system that was a federal crime under the DMCA. Instead, he was using his custom analyzer to passively sniff the data packets moving through the tractor's internal network. Lines of hexadecimal code flooded the dark screen of the Toughbook. Cyrus's eyes darted across the data, translating the raw machine language into understandable metrics. "All right," Cyrus muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let's look at the emissions array. NOx sensors, reading normal, DEF fluid pressure, optimal, exhaust temperature, perfectly within threshold." "Then why is it in limp mode?" Greg asked, baffled. "Because the tractor isn't broken," Cyrus said, a cold edge creeping into his voice. He highlighted a specific line of code on the screen. "Look at this timestamp. The error code wasn't generated by a sensor failure. It was pushed into the engine control module via the tractor's cellular telematics link. An over-the-air update triggered a forced fault state." Greg's face went pale. They shut my tractor down remotely. "They manufactured a crisis," Cyrus confirmed, closing the laptop. "They bricked your machine from the comfort of the dealership to force you into a $5,000 repair for a problem that doesn't exist. It's digital extortion." It was exactly what Cyrus needed. Over the next 3 weeks, Cyrus became a ghost moving through the High Grove agricultural community. He visited 12 different farms under the cover of darkness. He tapped into combine sprayers and utility tractors, downloading gigabytes of diagnostic logs. He found the same pattern everywhere: remote lockouts, false sensor readings pushed over the air, and undocumented software patches designed specifically to prevent independent mechanics from resetting basic maintenance timers. But Cyrus didn't stop there. He cross-referenced the data with the farmers' billing invoices. He found 6 distinct instances matching Greg's initial story major warranty claims filed by Coburn Implement to corporate for massive component replacements, transmissions, hydrostatic drives, main CPUs, where the physical parts on the tractors had never actually been removed. The factory serial numbers on the supposedly replaced parts perfectly matched the logs pulled from the machines. Wyatt was double-dipping on a massive scale, defrauding his own corporate supplier out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake warranty claims, while simultaneously bleeding the local farmers dry. Cyrus retreated to his farmhouse and spent 3 days compiling the data. He didn't write an angry letter. He engineered a weaponized dossier. He organized the telemetry data, the CAN bus logs, the matched serial numbers, and the corresponding fraudulent invoices into a flawless, irrefutable matrix of evidence. It was mathematically and legally bulletproof. He printed 3 copies. The first copy, securely bound and sealed, was sent via certified overnight mail to the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection in Washington, D.C., explicitly detailing violations of the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act and right to repair antitrust laws. The second copy went to the State Attorney General's office, alleging wire fraud and extortion. But Cyrus knew government agencies moved at a glacial pace. To crush Wyatt Coburn immediately, Cyrus had to hit him where he was most vulnerable, his supply line. The third copy, loaded onto an encrypted flash drive, was sent directly to Richard Caldwell, the Executive Vice President of Dealer Compliance at the agricultural manufacturer's global headquarters in Illinois. Cyrus didn't just send the drive. He included a single type sheet of paper that read, "Your top-grossing regional dealer in High Grove is embezzling from your warranty department and destroying your brand's reputation through forced telematics lockouts. Attached is the telemetry and financial proof. If your internal auditors are not on the ground at Coburn Implement and Supply within 48 hours, this entire data set goes to the Wall Street Journal and every major agricultural trade publication in the Midwest." Then Cyrus waited. It didn't take long. 2 days later, on a sweltering Tuesday morning, Cyrus drove his dusty F250 back into the gleaming parking lot of Coburn Implement and Supply. The scene was vastly different from his first visit. There were no farmers browsing the lot. Instead, 3 black, unmarked corporate SUVs were parked haphazardly near the front entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Cyrus could see a flurry of panicked activity. Men in dark suits were carrying boxes of files out of the accounting office. The young clerk Toby looked terrified, sitting perfectly still at the parts counter. Cyrus walked through the sliding glass doors, the heavy boots echoing on the polished concrete. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Wyatt Coburn was standing outside his glass-walled manager's office. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp, arrogant smile. His monogrammed shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his face flushed, and he was screaming into a cell phone, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't care what the regional director says. You can't freeze my inventory accounts. We have a partnership. Wyatt yelled, slamming his hand against the glass. He listened for a second, his face draining of color. "What do you mean, criminal referral?" He dropped the phone. It clattered against the granite floor. Wyatt looked up, his wild eyes locking on to Cyrus. For a long, silent moment, the two men stared at each other across the showroom floor. The reality of the situation slowly dawned on the dealership owner. Wyatt looked at the out-of-towner in the faded denim, remembering the man who had effortlessly diagnosed an obsolete hydraulic system, and realized with crushing certainty who had built the digital guillotine that had just dropped on his neck. Wyatt whispered, his voice trembling a mixture of rage and absolute terror. "You did this." Cyrus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply walked up to the granite parts counter, resting his calloused hands on the cool stone. He looked Wyatt dead in the eye, stripping away the last ounce of the man's manufactured authority. "I told you," Cyrus said, his voice low, steady, and carrying the weight of the entire Highgrove Valley. "I know how machines work, and I know how to break them." Cyrus turned his back on the ruined dealership owner and walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight. The air smelled like damp earth and growing soybeans. He climbed into his old Ford truck, put it in gear, and headed home. There was work to do. The harvest was coming, and for the first time in a long time, the fields belonged entirely to the farmers. The padlock on the gates of Coburn Implement and Supply was a heavy rusted master lock, a stark contrast to the gleaming multi-million-dollar facility it now secured. It took less than 72 hours for the corporate auditors, led by Richard Caldwell's ruthless internal investigations team, to uncover the staggering depth of Wyatt Coburn's fraud. Once the corporate safety net was pulled, the local authorities had no choice but to act. The state attorney general descended on Highgrove, freezing Wyatt's personal and business assets. The local sheriff, who had so conveniently looked the other way for years during their private hunting trips, was suddenly forced to recuse himself. As federal investigators began asking questions about complicity and kickbacks, for the farmers of Highgrove, it was as if a heavy, suffocating storm cloud had finally broken. But the fallout was chaotic. Hundreds of pieces of machinery were suddenly without a local authorized service center. The digital locks, however, remained. That was when Cyrus Reed transitioned from a solitary farmer to the architect of a local revolution. He didn't just fix his own equipment. He opened the doors of his barn to the entire valley. He partnered with Harrison Miller, a sharp, unyielding agricultural attorney from the neighboring county, to form the Highgrove Independent Growers Cooperative. While Harrison filed a devastating multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit against Wyatt Coburn for extortion and violation of the Consumer Fraud Act, Cyrus went to work on the iron. Night after night, Cyrus hosted clinics in his drafty barn. He stood in front of a whiteboard, his calloused hands covered in dry erase marker, teaching men like Tom Henderson and Greg Stanton how to read CAN bus data. He ordered open-source diagnostic cables in bulk from overseas and distributed them at cost. He showed them how to bypass the cellular antennas on their tractors, permanently severing the manufacturer's ability to push malicious remote shutdown codes to their engine control modules. He gave them their machines back, but Wyatt Coburn wasn't the kind of man to lose quietly. Stripped of his wealth, his dealership, and his reputation, the disgraced owner was out on bail, awaiting federal indictment. The humiliation of being dismantled by a man he viewed as a dirt-poor outsider festered into a dangerous, blinding rage. It happened in late August during a dry spell when the soybean stalks were turning brittle and golden. Cyrus was asleep in the farmhouse, the windows open to catch the faint night breeze. He didn't hear the tires crunching on the gravel at the end of his quarter-mile driveway, but his phone did. A silent, vibrating alert buzzed on his nightstand. Cyrus, accustomed to the strict security protocols of commercial shipyards, hadn't just fixed his tractor when he returned home. He had quietly installed a network of high-definition cellular trail cameras and thermal sensors along his property line. Cyrus grabbed his phone and opened the encrypted feed. A dark figure was moving swiftly through the shadows behind the main barn, carrying 2 heavy red jerry cans. Cyrus didn't panic. He pulled on his boots, grabbed a heavy steel wrench from his closet, and slipped out the back door, melting into the familiar darkness of his own property. By the time Cyrus rounded the corner of the barn, Wyatt Coburn was unscrewing the cap of the first jerry can, the pungent smell of raw diesel spilling into the hot night air. He was aiming for the side doors directly where the 1982 John Deere 4440 was parked. He wanted to burn the machine that had started it all and take the entire winter hay reserve with it. Before Wyatt could strike the match trembling in his hand, a blinding cascade of light erupted. Cyrus had wired the perimeter floodlights to a manual override switch on his phone. Wyatt gasped, dropping the match into the dirt as he threw his hands up against the sudden daylight-bright glare. Cyrus stepped out of the shadows, the steel wrench resting casually against his leg. Diesel needs a much higher flash point to ignite from a dropped match. Wyatt, Cyrus said, his voice terrifyingly calm in the still night. You'd know that if you ever actually worked on a machine instead of just stealing from the men who do. Wyatt froze, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He looked at Cyrus, then up at the 4 separate camera lenses mounted under the eaves, their red recording lights blinking steadily. It's over, Cyrus stated, pulling his phone from his pocket and dialing the state troopers. You just traded a white-collar wire fraud sentence for first-degree attempted arson. You're never stepping foot in this valley again. When the police cruisers finally hauled a weeping Wyatt Coburn away in the back of a squad car, Cyrus didn't stick around to watch the taillights fade. He walked into the barn, ran a hand over the cold green steel of the 4440's hood, and went back to sleep. October arrived in Highgrove with a crisp, biting chill. The harvest was a triumph, unlike anything the valley had seen in a decade. Cyrus sat in the cab of his combine, the forestry-grade hydraulic pump he had fabricated humming flawlessly beneath him. The dust plumed behind him in a massive golden cloud as he cut through the heavy, dry soybean pods. The yield monitors in the cab climbed higher and higher. It was a bumper crop rich and abundant, grown from dirt that had been in his family for generations. Looking out across the terraced acreage, Cyrus saw the neighboring fields alive with activity. Combines were rolling, grain carts were filling, and the air was thick with the scent of chaff and diesel. There were no flashing error codes. There were no stranded machines waiting on overpriced dealership technicians. There were just farmers working their own land with their own iron. Cyrus pulled the combine to the edge of the field and killed the threshing separator. He looked down the 12-mile stretch of county road that led back toward town. He had returned to Highgrove, expecting to bury a tractor and sell a farm. Instead, he had dismantled a tyrant, resurrected a community, and finally found the one thing he had been looking for since he left at 18. He was exactly where he came from, and he was never leaving again. If Cyrus's fight for the right to repair and his victory over corporate greed resonated with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who believes in standing up for the little guy, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories of hard karma and triumph. Drop a comment below, would you have taken on the dealership? See you next time.